Hello, my name is Dalton M. Today I will be presenting about the effects that racism and discrimination have on the mental health of African Americans. Racism has been a problem for African Americans all the way back to colonial times. Ever since, African Americans have had this roadblock in their lives, holding them back and preventing them success. For the majority of African Americans, racism has a negative impact on their mentality, making them feel anger and anxiety. However, for some, it may positively affect their mentality, making them more determined to prove the ones doubting them and the ones that don't believe in African American rights wrong. First off, racism creates anxiety in African Americans. Anxiety is the intense, excessive, and persistent worry and fear about everyday situations, according to Mayo Clinic. In an article from Medical News Today, What to Know About Anxiety in Black Communities, it states, Black Americans face several additional risk factors for anxiety. Those risk factors include exposure to racism and racist abuse, the effects of racism, such as fewer opportunities and less safe communities, and higher rates of trauma, including sexual assault and police violence. As explained in the quote, African Americans are at a greater risk of anxiety because of the traumatic experience that they go through in their lifetime. According to the same article, African Americans have a 20% higher rate of serious mental health issues than people in the general population. This statistic from the Anxiety and Depression Association of America shows the mental toll that racism has put on African Americans as compared to the general population that doesn't experience racism. Socioeconomic factors have made it harder for African Americans to find professional help for their mental problems. In the graph presented, you can see that there is a significant difference between the health insurance coverage of Blacks as compared to whites, with 11% more African American adults not having health insurance, with less access to health insurance, whether it be from their job not providing to them or not being able to afford it. African American adults have no exposure to professional help. With a high percent of serious mental health issues and less exposure to help, leaves African Americans alone with their fears, creating an even bigger toll on their minds. One example is a man who studied ecology at Clemson. He had the image of his favorite bird ruined and was scarred from an encounter with a racist. One day in the area where he would go to spot his favorite bird, a white man who owned property nearby started a conversation explaining that his family had been there for generations, and the N-word, who used to pick and gin the family's cotton, suddenly knew how to do the job. Here you can see the man is expressing his racial views. The statement hints that the man thinks African Americans should still be picking cotton for white people. He added that he hated trespassers and let Lanham know he was armed. It was a threat disguised as a chat, Lanham said. As Lanham drove away, he heard the man firing a gun behind a nearby barn, and I thought about how very careful I have always been about trespassing signs, says Lanham. As you can see, this encounter, which was meant to be intimidating and hateful towards Lanham, because of his race, left him scarred, ruining the image of his favorite bird. Every time he sees that bird, and every time he sees a no trespassing sign, he is forced to recall this encounter. The encounter has created PTSD for Lanham. The sad fact is, this has happened to African Americans all over the United States, whether it be with an encounter with a police officer, or not being helped at a grocery store, or even getting looks at while out in public. Next, let's take a look at how racism creates anger within African Americans. Anger is expressed through the perspective of African American protesters. According to the New York Times article, George Floyd Protests, A Timeline by Derek Bison Taylor, in cities across the United States, tens of thousands of people have swarmed the streets to express their outrage and sorrow during the day. That has descended into nights of unrest with reports of shootings, looting, and vandalism in some cities. The events of looting, shootings, and vandalism shows the expression of anger towards the killing of an African American man by a police officer who used excessive force by kneeling on a man's neck. The events of George Floyd's death built anguish in the African American community. The article also presents an image that illustrates the events of riots in Minneapolis, where it depicts a police station and businesses torched on fire by protesters. In the second photo, you can see people taking action and going out to streets to protest peacefully. Once again, the African American community was overtook with anger at this society that has ignored their struggles and their cries for help for so long. Considering that not all stress is bad, in some cases stress can give you strength and help you get more done, quoted from Hansa D. Bargov, medical professional. Some African Americans use the stress that is caused from racist acts towards them to affect their mentality in a positive way, making them more determined and self-confident. One example is within the mindset of Serena Williams. In the article, The Meaning of Serena, explains her coach's methods of training. He describes toughing the girls' skin by bringing busloads of kids from the local schools into Compton to surround the courts while Venus and Serena practiced. I had the kids call them every curse word in the English language, he writes. I paid them to do it and told them to do their worst. This shows the impact being hated on can have on someone with the right mentality, someone that has confidence in themselves, someone that doesn't let others' words get to them, but uses it to their advantage. Another example of African American self-confidence is in the story of Fritz Pollard, the first African American coach in the NFL. In the CNN article, Black People in History, Little Known Figures to Know, it states, back when he was a player, fans taunted him with racial slurs, and opposing players tried to maim him. But Pollard, a swift and elusive runner, often had the last laugh. I didn't get mad at them and want to fight them, he once said. I would just look at them and grin, and the next minute run for an 80-yard touchdown. This is a prime example of using hate to fuel success. Instead of getting mad and losing his head, getting out of his game, he let it make him play better. Considering the evidence, the effects of racism have massive negative effects on the mentality of a majority of African Americans, causing them stress, anger, and anxiety. While it also can have positive effects, building more self-confidence and determination within African Americans, as seen in the most successful African Americans today. The realization of the pain that racism causes will awaken the importance and the yearn for equality around the world. Do you have any questions?
I do have 2 questions for you. First question, how valid and reliable were the sources that you used, and then how do you know they were?
The sources that I used, when talking about the anxiety part, I used a lot of medical research and like psychological research from medical professionals. And some of the facts that I used were from news sources that cover like the big stories like CNN, New York Times, and stuff like that.
Okay. And if you had more time, what additional research would you have conducted?
I would have found maybe more about stress, how it causes more stress on them, and also how African Americans, like how they deal with it, like get their point of view, how they personally use it to be more determined.